February 14, 1942. London, early evening. The blackout curtains were drawn tight against the winter dusk as Winston Churchill sat forward in his chair, cigar unlit, listening in silence. Across the room stood a thin, intense British officer with burning eyes and a reputation for instability. His name was Orde Wingate. His proposal bordered on heresy. Wingate spoke of fighting the Japanese not at the front, but behind it, deep behind it. He wanted to send lightly armed columns hundreds of miles into enemy-held Burma, supplied by air, cut off from retreat, striking railways, depots, and command posts. Conventional lines would be abandoned, encirclement would be accepted as doctrine. Around the table, senior officers shifted uneasily. Britain was losing ground across Asia. Singapore had fallen just days earlier, along with 80,000 men. Rangoon was under threat. The empire was bleeding. This was not the moment, many believed, for experiments. Churchill saw something else. He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and broke the silence. This, he said, was the right kind of idea. Not because it was safe, not because it was proven, but because it was bold. And Britain, cornered and humiliated, had little left to lose. The Prime Minister had long believed that audacity could compensate for weakness. In 1940, it had saved Britain from invasion. Now, in 1942, with Japanese forces advancing at a rate of 50 miles a day through the jungle, audacity was again being offered as a weapon. Wingate pressed on. He argued that Japanese superiority in mobility and morale could be broken by surprise, that small, disciplined units could paralyze a much larger enemy, that fear could be turned against itself. Others at the table saw recklessness. They saw a man who disregarded hierarchy, ignored doctrine, and spoke with messianic certainty. They saw disaster waiting to happen. Churchill saw defiance. He asked one question: could this force live off the air? Wingate answered yes. Aircraft could drop food, ammunition, or even mules. The jungle would become a battlefield without lines. Churchill nodded. He had made his decision. Backing Wingate meant staking scarce aircraft, trained troops, and political credibility on an untested theory. It meant defying cautious generals and accepted military logic. But in a war defined by catastrophe, Churchill believed caution was the greater risk. This was the moment Britain chose to gamble. The gamble had roots far older than that winter evening in London. Orde Wingate was not a product of the British Army's comfortable middle ground. He had always lived at the edges of doctrine and temperament. Born in 1903 to a deeply religious family, he grew up believing that destiny favored the uncompromising. By the time war arrived, compromise was not in his vocabulary. His reputation was already notorious. In Palestine, between 1936 and 1939, Wingate had organized Jewish night squads to hunt Arab insurgents. He ignored conventional restraints, operated aggressively, and achieved results that embarrassed more orthodox commanders. He also made enemies, many of them senior, many of them permanent. By 1942, his file contained equal measures of praise and alarm. Burma, however, was collapsing faster than any committee could manage. Japanese forces had crossed the border in December 1941. Within weeks, British and Indian units were retreating through terrain they barely understood, harried by an enemy that moved faster, traveled lighter, and seemed to thrive in the jungle. Roads disappeared, supply lines dissolved, morale followed. By January 1942, British intelligence estimated that Japanese divisions were advancing with less than half the logistical burden of their European counterparts. They marched at night. They infiltrated through terrain deemed impassable. They attacked from directions no map accounted for. Traditional responses failed. Defensive lines were outflanked. Counterattacks arrived too late. Every retreat fed the perception that the Japanese were unstoppable. Wingate believed that perception was the true enemy. He argued that the jungle nullified mass and rewarded nerve. That Japanese confidence, bordering on arrogance, could be shattered if British troops appeared where they should not exist. Not on roads, not on fronts, but behind headquarters, behind supply depots, behind the illusion of control. His proposal was radical, even by desperate standards. Entire brigades would march into enemy territory with no expectation of relief. They would cut communications, ambush convoys, destroy bridges, then disappear. Their survival would depend on air supply, navigation by compass, and the will to endure disease, isolation, and encirclement. To many generals, this was not warfare. It was improvisation elevated to policy. General Sir Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief India, listened carefully but cautiously. He understood the crisis. He also understood that if Wingate failed, the blame would not stop with him. Aircraft diverted to supply columns in the jungle would not be available elsewhere. Trained troops lost could not be replaced. Churchill intervened directly. He bypassed layers of resistance with a single directive. Wingate would be given a chance. A limited one, but real. The unit would be called the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade. Its men would later earn a name that carried both pride and fatalism, the Chindits, after the Burmese lion demon, half beast, half guardian. Training began under conditions designed to break hesitation. Forced marches of 30 miles a day, live-fire jungle exercises. Supply drops were practiced again and again until failure became unacceptable. Men were taught that isolation was not a mistake, but a condition. Wingate drove them relentlessly. He slept little, ate less. He lectured endlessly on purpose and inevitability. Officers noted his intensity bordered on obsession, but discipline held. Behind closed doors, skepticism remained sharp. One staff officer wrote that the plan courted annihilation with enthusiasm. Another warned that the air supply in monsoon conditions was a fantasy. Churchill read the objections. He did not rescind his support. In war, he believed, the greatest danger was predictability, and Wingate, for all his flaws, was unpredictable. By the summer of 1942, the decision was locked in. Britain would test a new kind of warfare, not because it was safe, but because the old ways were failing. There would be no retreat from this choice. The first test came not in theory, but in movement. On the night of February 13, 1943, nearly 1 year after that meeting in London, the Chindits crossed the Chindwin River under cover of darkness. The water was cold, the banks steep, and the silence absolute. Once across, they were inside Japanese-held Burma. There would be no formal front to retreat to, only jungle. Wingate divided his force into 8 columns, each roughly 400 men strong. They moved light and fast, carrying radios, explosives, and enough rations to reach the first supply drop. Everything else would fall from the sky or be taken from the enemy. Each column commander understood the rule. If cut off, they would not turn back. They would strike and keep moving. Japanese intelligence initially dismissed reports of British troops behind the lines. Patrols were assumed lost. Supply depots were thought to be raided by bandits. Then, railway bridges began to vanish. Telegraph lines went dead. Trains derailed in the night. Within weeks, the illusion of control fractured. Japanese commanders were forced to divert entire battalions to rear area security. Units meant for the front were reassigned to hunt ghosts in the jungle. Supply convoys moved more slowly. Fear spread faster. The Chindits had done what Wingate promised. They had turned the enemy inward on itself. But the cost was severe. Air supply proved fragile. Drop zones were missed. Crates smashed into trees. Some columns went days without food. Malaria and dysentery spread relentlessly. Leeches clung to flesh. Boots rotted. Radios failed in the humidity. Wounded men were carried for miles or left with a pistol and orders to hold as long as possible. Wingate accepted these losses with brutal clarity. This was the price of intrusion. Not everyone agreed. Messages from the field grew darker. One column commander wrote that his men were near the limits of endurance. Another reported that Japanese patrols were closing in with increasing coordination. What began as a surprise was hardening into a pursuit. By April, the Japanese adapted. They began blocking likely routes, flooding jungle tracks with troops, and reinforcing key nodes. The Chindits found themselves fighting not against confusion, but against the response. Extraction became the critical test. Wingate ordered his columns to break apart and withdraw independently. Some made it, others did not. Entire units vanished into the jungle, emerging weeks later reduced to half strength or less. When the operation ended in May 1943, fewer than two-thirds of the original force returned. Nearly 1,000 men were lost to combat, disease, or exhaustion. For a conventional operation, the numbers would have been unacceptable. Churchill demanded the results be measured differently. Japanese records confirmed that entire divisions had been diverted to counter the Chindits. Supply lines were disrupted for months. Confidence had been shaken. For the first time in Burma, the Japanese had been forced to defend rather than advance. Churchill called the operation a success. Not a clean one, not an efficient one, but a necessary one. Wingate was summoned to Quebec later that year to brief Churchill and President Roosevelt personally. He spoke with the same certainty, the same intensity. He argued that the Chindits had proven the concept, that with more men, more aircraft, and greater autonomy, entire campaigns could be reshaped. Many listeners remained unconvinced, but in wartime, momentum carries weight. Churchill, once again, sided with audacity. The experiment would not end in Burma, it would expand. By early 1944, Wingate stood at the height of his influence. Promoted to Major General, granted direct access to the highest councils of Allied command, he was no longer a tolerated eccentric. He was an architect of strategy. His ideas now shaped planning across the China-Burma-India theater. Operation Thursday was conceived on a scale that left no margin for failure. More than 10,000 men would be inserted by glider and transport aircraft deep into northern Burma. They would seize jungle clearings, construct airstrips by hand, and establish fortified strongholds, bases from which long-range columns could operate indefinitely behind enemy lines. This was no raid. It was an occupation without conquest. Churchill approved the plan personally. Aircraft were diverted, resources reallocated. General Joseph Stilwell, commanding American forces in the region, remained openly skeptical. He feared that Wingate's forces would become liabilities, pinned, besieged, and demanding constant resupply. But the decision had already passed the point of reversal. On the night of March 5, 1944, gliders carrying the first Chindits lifted off from India. Many crashed on landing. Trees shredded wings. Men died before firing a shot. Yet the airstrips were built. Planes landed. Supplies arrived. The strongholds were named with defiant irony: Broadway, White City, Aberdeen. The Japanese response was immediate and ferocious. Infantry assaults came day and night. Artillery was dragged through jungle paths thought to be impassable. Wave after wave struck the Chindit positions. Casualties mounted rapidly. Air supply kept the garrisons alive, but barely. Then, on March 24, 1944, fate intervened with ruthless finality. Wingate boarded a B-25 Mitchell bomber near Imphal to return to his headquarters. The weather was poor, visibility was minimal. Shortly after takeoff, the aircraft struck a hillside in the Naga Hills. There were no survivors. The man who had embodied the strategy was gone. Reaction was immediate and unsettling. Without Wingate's relentless drive, the operation lost its advocate. Command passed to officers who did not share his tolerance for loss or isolation. Decisions became cautious. Requests for reinforcement grew urgent. Japanese pressure intensified. Chindit units found themselves increasingly static. Their mobility, their defining strength, eroded. Casualties from disease and exhaustion now rivaled those from combat. By the summer of 1944, the Chindits were withdrawn. Of the 10,000 men committed, nearly 3,000 were killed, wounded, or incapacitated. Entire battalions were rendered combat ineffective. Churchill defended the outcome publicly. He insisted the operation had tied down Japanese divisions during critical battles elsewhere, including Imphal and Koama. Strategically, he argued, the sacrifice had been justified. Privately, doubts crept in. Without Wingate, his ideas lost momentum. The concept of large-scale, sustained deep penetration forces fell out of favor. Special operations would continue, but not on this scale, not with this autonomy. The gamble had reached its limit. The cost had been paid. In the months that followed, the arguments over Wingate's legacy hardened into doctrine. Supporters pointed to maps and timetables, Japanese divisions delayed, supply routes disrupted, pressure is relieved at decisive moments. They argued that in a theater defined by terrain and distance, Wingate had forced the enemy to fight on unfamiliar terms. Critics pointed to casualty lists, to men broken by disease rather than battle, to formations rendered unusable for the rest of the war. They argued that success measured only by disruption was too abstract to justify the human cost. Churchill listened to both and rendered no final verdict. What could not be denied was that something fundamental has shifted. The British Army, long anchored to tradition and method, had sanctioned a form of warfare built on risk, autonomy, and calculated exposure. It had done so not because it was elegant, but because desperation demanded imagination. Churchill's words from 1942 echoed through later memoranda. The war, he insisted, would not be won by caution alone. Victory belonged to those willing to unsettle the enemy and themselves. Wingate did not live to defend his vision. He left no memoir, only fragments, orders, lectures, after-action reports dense with conviction. Those who served under him remembered a commander who demanded belief as much as obedience. Those above him remembered a man who made refusal difficult. After the war, the Chindits faded from public memory, overshadowed by cleaner victories and clearer heroes. Yet their influence endured quietly. Air supply as doctrine, special forces operating beyond conventional fronts, the acceptance that disruption itself could be a strategic objective. This was not a triumphal story. It was a story of choice under pressure. In 1942, Britain faced an enemy advancing faster than its institutions could respond. When Orde Wingate proposed fighting behind enemy lines, he asked for trust without guarantees. Churchill, isolated but resolute, gave it. He did so knowing the cost might be severe, knowing the results might be ambiguous, knowing that once unleashed, such warfare could not be neatly contained. History would judge the outcome unevenly, but the moment itself remains clear. At a time when retreat seemed inevitable, Britain chose to advance, into uncertainty, into the jungle, into risk. That decision could not be undone.